What fundamental ideas shape the world? In the title essay of her book For the New Intellectual, Ayn Rand overviews the history of the world and several fundamental ideas, several types of people who hold them. Each type of person has a distinct method of thought, what Rand would call a psychoepistemology. Welcome to session A2 of the New Intellectual Book Study. I'm Cody Leibelt, and we are discussing Ayn Rand's title essay in her book For the New Intellectual. Today it's pages 23 to 37, at least in this version of the book, which I know there's different versions. But this is the middle portion of that title essay. This is the second of the three discussions that we're doing. In our last discussion, Rand explained the meaning of two historical archetypes, Attila and the witch doctor. The first is the man of brute action. The second, the man of ideas of a higher reality, a reality that is divorced from the one in which we live. This week, we resume Rand's overview of world history, starting at the end of the High Middle Ages, when Thomas Aquinas flourished around 1250 AD. Now, let's go ahead in the book to the last section that we had read last week. She had said that the prelude to the Renaissance was the return of Aristotle by Thomas Aquinas. So, picking up where we were, the Renaissance, writes Rand, the rebirth of man's mind blasted the rule of the witch doctor sky high, setting the earth free of his power. The liberation was not total, nor was it immediate. The convulsions lasted for centuries, but the cultural influence of mysticism, of avowed mysticism, was broken. Men could no longer be told to reject their mind as an impotent tool, when the proof of its potency was so magnificently evident that the lowest perceptual level mentality was not able to fully evade it. Men were seeing the achievements of science. So Rand's overview of history here is very broad brush, but she's pointing to the impact of Thomas Aquinas and others in his school of thought that agreed with him and agreed with him about the emphasis of Aristotle. If you are familiar with the history of philosophy through the Middle Ages, philosophy became much more Aristotelian, and Aquinas is a fusion of Christianity and Aristotle, very explicitly so. This is because of the rediscovery of Aristotle in the Middle Ages. Aristotle had not been available. His writings had not been available to, at least not all of them, not all the ones we have today. They had not been available in Western Europe, although they had been available in other nations, especially Muslim nations. But when Aristotle was rediscovered by Western European thinkers and then accepted as an important thinker, this had a change, and Rand is going with the majority opinion historically, which is to say that the reintroduction of Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas and others eventually was one of the precipitating events that led to Western Europe's Renaissance. Now, if you're familiar with the history of Western art, like painting or music, you'll understand how important that is. It's the beginnings of the move toward Western Europe's Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. And you can see the connection between somebody like Aristotle, who was a scientist. He didn't have this otherworldly philosophy, but he had an earth-oriented scientific philosophy, and it emphasized logic as well. And the medieval scholars were all about the logic of Aristotle. So that is just broad brush. She thinks that Aristotle is the driver of history, that his influence led to the changes of dethroning Attila. There, generally within Ayn Rand's thought, there is a very low view of what life was like in the Middle Ages, or before that, the Dark Ages. The way that the historians have looked at this time in history, say from the year 500 to the year 1300, has changed over time. Rand's perspective is very negative. I think that she is perhaps colored against having any kind of appreciation for this period of time because of the dominance of Christianity, which she rejected. Nevertheless, as long as you're able to look at what she's saying in broad strokes, to the extent that there were Attilas in charge of Western Europe and that they ruled by brute force, we can agree with Rand that the kind of negative effects that she described were in play. Any interaction with that before we move into the next section in the book?
There's an excellent book I read. It's called The Genesis of Science, and I believe it was by a Yale historian, and his name escapes me for the moment, but James Hannum. So, I mean, a lot of what people have typically been told about the Middle Ages. We typically have this idea that, people were just these superstitious, dirty people, and that science was stunted for 1,000 years. But a lot of the stereotypes about history are just not true. People in the Middle Ages never believed the Earth was flat. They never banned the zero. So a lot of the things that people are told about the Middle Ages, they don't line up with modern scholarship. And that's why, modern historians really reject the term Dark Ages, because what happened during the Middle Ages was actually quite a lot of progress. I mean, would you want to live back then as opposed to now? Definitely not. But, we are talking over webcam, we have smartphones. A lot of what we have these days in the 21st century is built on the scientific discoveries that were made during that time period. If you study that time period, that's really when the foundations of the scientific revolution happened. It wasn't like people just woke up one day and said, it's the Renaissance, let's go ahead and invent science. It's like, no, a lot of what happened that made the modern world possible happened during that 1,000-year period that we call the Middle Ages.
Greg's background is in science. He has several science degrees, and so his interest and the knowledge of the history of that is going to go beyond mine. But what I do understand about that time period is that they called it the Dark Ages because we had a lack of information about what happened, a lack of recordings. And then eventually, once it was discovered what happened, it has been confirmed that the role of the church and the role of Christianity in Western civilization is significant and beneficial overall, even if we could look at certain things like the Spanish Inquisition and say there were things there that we disagree with and that had a devastating effect on certain people at certain times. All right, let's go on in the reading. So it's on page 24 in my version. It says, the Renaissance did not dethrone Attila at once. He clung to his fading power a while longer, building his absolute monarchies on the remnants of his crumbling feudal state. But once again, as in the Greco-Roman era, Attila was ineffectual when left on his own. Okay, so this is speaking to people that are well-read in history. It's very broad brush, but she is characterizing the Renaissance as a time in which the monarchs, the kings, did not have absolute power over their people. And she says one of the reasons why that would be is because not the Attilas, but the witch doctors that she's going to describe, the witch doctors did not have as much power as they would need in order to dominate society. So we go to the bottom of this page. She says that the divine right of kings was not much of a weapon against men who were discovering the rights of man. The divine right of kings is a common phrase if you are looking at Western European history in the 1700s. It was a debate that was developing about why do kings have the right to dominate others. And one of the arguments was because God said so. That's called the divine right of kings. But the other side of that debate was the side that came to dominate. And that's the side that was in agreement with, say, John Locke, the side that says there is such thing as individual rights. Rand goes on, the Industrial Revolution completed the task of the Renaissance. It blasted Attila off his throne. Now, for details, see all of history, but you have to look at what the Industrial Revolution did to the economies and the governments of the world. This is a big issue. But her claim, broad brush, is correct, that the Industrial Revolution led to changes in the amount of power that societies, the central authorities could have over people. The wealth increased dramatically, and the level of dependence on a central government for dictating what you're able to do economically changed. If you look in the United States, this is the key example, but also in England. For the first time in history, men gained control over physical nature and threw off the control of men over men. That is, men discovered science and political freedom. This is true. Historically, more people discovered science and political freedom at this time. The first society in history whose leaders were neither Attilas nor witch doctors, a society led, dominated, and created by the producers, was the United States of America. And the rest of the world soon looked to America as example. England, as well as France, Italy, Germany, Netherlands, and other nations eventually in the East, Japan, for example, they looked at what was going on distinctively in the United States and they said, how can we imitate that? And they did. Now, Rand writes, the moral code implicit in its political principles was not self-sacrifice. The political principles embodied in the Constitution were not Attila's blank check on brute force. That's explicitly, the Constitution is designed to limit government. So what was the principle? It was men's protection against any future Attila's ambition. Against tyranny was the goal. I'm at the top of page 25. The Founding Fathers were thinkers, writes Rand, who were also men of action. So unlike Attila and unlike the witch doctor, they understood the connection between thought and action. They didn't believe the way the Platonic witch doctors did in some higher world of abstractions that imposed upon them an external sense of duty. Rather, they thought in terms of, this is my life, what needs to be done, how can I think about the solutions to the problems I'm facing, and so therefore let's write the Constitution. So they were thinkers and men of action. And noticeably, they were businessmen and lawyers. So these were people that had read Locke but were not professional philosophers. They were men of action that realized the need for ideas. So thinkers and men of action. Rand writes, they proclaimed man's right to the pursuit of happiness, and they determined to establish on earth the conditions required for man's proper existence. Now, she points out that reason requires freedom. These men were, because of the developments of philosophy in the age of reason leading up to this time, they respected reason. They respected the idea that an individual has rights. And those two came together, reason and freedom. Rand writes, intellectual freedom cannot exist without political freedom. Political freedom cannot exist without economic freedom. A free mind and a free market are corollaries. This is a famous statement from Rand, that a free mind and a free market are corollaries. So she describes the social system that they put into place, and it has now become known as capitalism, especially laissez-faire capitalism. And she points out it wasn't perfect laissez-faire capitalism. There were regulations. For example, they had tariffs, which Rand would disagree with. There were certain things that were not like the income tax that we have today, but that were used to finance the government at that time that Rand would disagree with. Nevertheless, and of course they had a regulatory system of some kind that goes beyond what Rand would usually advocate. Rand is very anti-economic regulations. But the point is that compared to what we have today or what we've ever had in history, it was the freest that the world has ever been. Rand writes, during the 19th century, which she loves the 19th century, during that century, the world came close to economic freedom for the first and only time in history. The degree of any country's economic freedom was the exact degree of its progress. America, the freest, achieved the most. I'll mention if you've ever been to a railroad museum or if you've looked at exhibits of other things about the 19th century, the expansion of the economy and the conquest of nature during the 19th century came at a pace that even makes the 20th or the 21st century look a little bit not ambitious. Just in 5 years or 10 years, doubling the amount of railroads that go across the country, and then doubling it again in the next 5 or 10 years. And the amount of steel put onto the ground at that time, and the amount of change that created for human life. It's not happened like that in recent decades. The way that the world looks today is not all that different if you watch Back to the Future from the way it looked in 1985. But even the difference from 1985 to 1955, when he goes back in time, big difference. But we're stagnating. Since the 1970s and 80s, the world has stagnated. We don't have the flying cars that we expected. We just have the internet and Zoom. That's what we have. Congratulations, we have Facebook. But so I agree with Rand in her appreciation of the 19th century. And there's actually good material within her other writings about some of the great industrialists and how they were not all robber barons, although some of them were. Any interactions before we move to the next section?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, Yaron Brook, who's, famous subjectivist philosopher, he points out that those parts of the economy that are the least regulated and, have the least government weight put on top of them, those are the industries that are really, really advancing very quickly. Think of like the smartphone industry, think of a lot of the computer stuff, a lot of technology, whereas medicine, is very heavily regulated. Education is, run by the government for the most part, and those are the industries that are really lagging behind. If I go to a university, the way the classes are taught are very similar to how things were taught in the 1500s. You have a talking head in front of the classroom. And I think that there's a lot of things in both healthcare and in education that could really be updated if it weren't for those heavy regulations.
Yeah, I agree with that. Also, if you look at spaceflight, do you know how they were trying to launch the Artemis unmanned version of an orbiter this week, and they weren't able to because of the storms? But if you, I was looking at the history of NASA. I mean, it's been like 55 years or something since we landed on the moon, right? Is it how long? But the technology that has been developed today by NASA is just a recreation of the Apollo project, mixed with some Frankenstein elements from the Space Shuttle project. And so it's well named because, you know, Apollo and Artemis were twins, like in the myths. But Artemis looks like it's got the solid rocket boosters of the Space Shuttle, and then it's got the Apollo in the middle. And it's actually, I was reading about why it is the way it is. They had a constellation project that was going to be developed, and then it got canceled. But then the congressman protested because it's basically a jobs project, a government jobs project for each one of their individual states, creating the elements that go into this. And so then they said, well, let's not cancel it. So then they backtread and they said, let's make something that's not originally designed to be what this is, but they cobbled it together like a Frankenstein. It's pretty sad. It's pretty sad what is happening to NASA. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
I read one book, I can't remember what it was called, but basically explained that we could do a Mars mission for around $40 billion. And, you know, you think of how much the government spends even on science, it's like that would be a drop in the bucket. But then towards the end, he says, actually, if you did this through the private industry, it could be done for about $4 billion. You know, so he said you could do a complete Mars mission. It was sending 4 people to Mars, you know, and bringing them back, of course, you know, for around $4 billion. And I think it's very interesting that, you know, instead of doing that, you know, we're just messing around in low Earth orbit, seeing, well, what are the effects of zero gravity. And the author said, hey, you know, if we do a Mars mission like this, you know, we should have a rotating spaceship with basically artificial gravity. And so all of that was factored into his $40 billion or $4 billion budget, depending on who's paying for it.
You compare that to what the United States is doing right now. Of course, sending billions of dollars in funding to Ukraine, or spending $1.5 trillion on developing one fighter jet. It's unconscionable. So I would say that I agree with Rand's overall point here, that there has been a stagnation, and it's due to regulation, it's due to government control of these industries. So we go on in the reading, capitalism wiped out slavery in matter and in spirit. So she's still talking about the 1900s. Of course, the American Civil War comes to mind, and the chattel slavery system that was present in the Americas comes to mind. So, but she points out that capitalism wiped out slavery. That is a very big claim. It's something that we could discuss, but I'll grant her it for now. It replaced Attila and the witch doctor. So who came to prominence? Instead of the Attila, it was the businessman, and instead of the witch doctor, it was the intellectual. This is the better version of those two men. Capitalism demands the best of every man, his rationality, and rewards him accordingly. Top of 26, Rand writes that when men are free to trade, with reason and reality as their only arbiter, when no man may use physical force to extort the consent of another, it is the best product and the best judgment that win in every field of human endeavor, and raise the standard of living and of thought. She goes on, the professional intellectual is the field agent of the army, whose commander-in-chief is the philosopher. She sees the philosopher as being the most important person moving history. So I think she and every other philosopher tend to agree with that. The intellectual carries the application of philosophical principles to every field of human endeavor. She writes that he sets society's course of transmitting ideas from the ivory tower. This is a good little sequence here. She says, from the ivory tower of the philosopher to the university professor, to the writer, to the artist, to the newspaper man, to the politician, to the movie maker, to the nightclub singer, to the man in the street. I think that was well thought out, because that really is how ideas come down. If you think about what the nightclub singer is singing, even just the moral code and the view of life that comes to us, to our ears, is going to have traced back from where they picked it up in movies and where they picked it up from their politicians, the newspapermen, and on back up to professors. This is why it matters so much that we understand the goals of the radical progressive movement today, to do a march through history, through our institutions. This is why it matters. So Rand goes on, I'm skipping ahead. The intellectual is the eyes, the ears, the voice of the free society. It's his job to observe the events of the world, to evaluate their meaning, and to inform the men in all the other fields. Top of 27, I'm just summarizing what she says. The more specialized and diversified a society, the greater its need for the integrating power of knowledge. And it becomes a full-time profession to develop knowledge and organize it. A free society has to count on the honor of its intellectuals, because there's a division of labor here. Now, Rand goes on and describes the professional businessman. Notice that she's going to say that he is the field agent of the army whose lieutenant commander-in-chief is the scientist. So she positions the scientist as the lieutenant commander-in-chief, not the philosopher. The philosopher is the commander. But she says the businessman carries scientific discoveries from the laboratory of the inventor to industrial plants. And she goes on, he organizes human effort into productive enterprises. He creates employment for men of countless professions. He's the great liberator, because he frees people from the need of intense manual labor that goes hour after hour. At the bottom of this page, the businessman has raised men's standard of living, but the intellectual has dropped men's standard of thought to the level of an impotent savage. So Rand thinks that the businessmen generally are better and more useful in our society today than the intellectuals. And it's the intellectuals who are shamefully not doing their job. Top of 28. The events of any given period of history are the result of the thinking of the preceding period. I think that's an important observation. You realize that the events happening today follow from the thinking of 50 years ago, and that whatever the intellectuals are saying today is leading to something that's going to happen in 50 years. She says the 19th century, with its political freedom, science, industry, business, trade, and all the necessary conditions of material progress, was the result in the last achievement of the intellectual power released by the Renaissance. I think that this is accurate to the way you can observe history, because right around the time that the American Revolution was happening, Immanuel Kant was writing. The American Revolution didn't come from Kant. It came from Locke, 50 or 100 years before. Whereas the works of Hegel and later of Marx, and then the political expression of Marxism, that is a result of Kant. So that's how it worked historically. Now, she's going to trace back in time, how did this all happen? She says that the American Revolution was ultimately a result of an Aristotelian influence. But after Aquinas and the prominence of Aristotle within Western civilization, who was the next most important thinker after Aquinas? She mentions René Descartes. Now, René Descartes attempted to throw away all of what he considered confusions, layers of sophistry, scholasticism, and he was a Catholic, but he tried to ask himself, how can we make sure that all the things that we know, that we actually know? And he invented this idea of methodological doubt, which consists of proclaiming that you have reason to doubt something when you don't actually have reason to doubt it. So she writes, Descartes, and this is, by the way, in the 1600s, late 1500s, I believe, 1600s. Descartes began with the basic epistemological premise of every witch doctor, a premise he shared explicitly with Augustine. She calls it the prior certainty of consciousness. That's his premise. What does that mean? Well, it's the belief that the existence of an external world is not self-evident, but must be proved by deduction from the contents of one's consciousness. Which means the concept of consciousness is some faculty other than the faculty of perception. Which means the indiscriminate contents of one's consciousness as the irreducible primary and absolute to which reality has to conform. And if you're familiar with the history of Western philosophy, if you've taken any courses on Western philosophy, Descartes is the key figure that influenced all that came after him. So from Descartes to Leibniz and Spinoza, and eventually to David Hume, and as well as to some degree even John Locke, who was good, but he's a mixed case. And if you think of others as well, I don't remember all the names, but in this period from the end of the Renaissance all the way up to the modern time, which began with Kant, everybody was influenced by what Descartes said here. And you can see it if you look at their individual philosophies. They're crazy philosophies where they start with the idea of something has to exist in your mind. And perhaps your mind is a group of little molecules called monads. And they spout off these, I call them rationalistic theories. Theories of explaining everything in terms of thoughts. Because that's where they start. Interactions with that? Anyone have any comments? Okay, I'll move forward, but go ahead and you can cut in anybody. But this is what Rand writes. What followed was the grotesquely tragic spectacle of philosophers struggling to prove existence. The existence of an external world. By staring with a witch doctor's blind inward state at the random twists of their conceptions. And then eventually their sensations and eventually their perceptions and things like that. So that leads from Descartes to Hume. If you're familiar with Western philosophy, this is a broad brush, but I believe it's accurate. That eventually they began to doubt everything, especially external existence. All right, top of 29 in my book, they doubted whether man was conscious at all and whether anything existed for him to be conscious of. That's where methodological doubt as a starting point leads you. That said, there are good things in Descartes. Rand is not intentionally throwing out everything in Descartes, and the objectivists would not either. But they disagree with him about his starting point. They think it's a tragic error historically. And if you're familiar with our Objectivism book study, you'll understand much more about these issues, about why that's a problem. So in the middle of page 29, Attila, who hated and feared intellectual issues, saw his chance to take over the intellect and found his voice. So around the time of David Hume, when philosophers were proclaiming that you can't really know that there's such thing as cause and effect or identity, you can't know that things are going to be a certain way tomorrow, Attila says, oh, that's interesting. So you're saying that the mind is futile. Because that's what I've been thinking all along. This is good. This is a justification for my overall outlook on life. Rand writes, when Hume declared that the apparent existence of an object did not guarantee that it would not vanish spontaneously the next moment. And the sunrise of today did not prove that the sun would rise tomorrow. When you declared that philosophical speculation was a game like chess or hunting, of no significance whatever to the practical course of human existence, since reason proved that existence was unintelligible, and only the ignorant maintained the illusion of knowledge, all of this, accompanied by a vehement opposition to the mysticism of the witch doctor, and by protestations of loyalty to reason and science, what men were hearing was the manifesto of a philosophical movement that can be designated only as Attilaism. That's her summary of David Hume's philosophy. I concur. She goes on, if it were possible for an animal to describe the content of its consciousness, the result would be a transcript of Hume's philosophy. She says, it's like a consciousness limited to the perceptual level of awareness, passively reacting to the experience of immediate concretes with no capacity to form abstractions. Top of page 30 in my book, she describes this post-Renaissance philosophy, this philosophy in the time from Descartes all the way to Hume, as a concerted attack on man's conceptual faculty. And she doesn't say that it was intentional, it's just that's what it amounted to implicitly. And some of the people that set out to defend reason ended up being its worst destroyers. They were unable to offer us a problem. They were unable to offer a solution to the problem of universals, writes Rand. If you've listened to our Objectivism book study, we've discussed this problem in depth. It's the core issue in her epistemology, is her theory of concepts, otherwise known as universals. And even to the point where Jacob Brunton and I don't completely agree on the issue. He would fall more into the historical realism approach, and Objectivism's approach can appear different from realism. And so to most people that affirm realism, Objectivism looks like a different variation of nominalism. I'll just point that out, that there is an open issue there, even in the discussion between me and Jacob about whether the Objectivists are 100% right on this. Nevertheless, we both look at each other's perspectives on this question and we say, what you're saying is good enough to be a basis for us to affirm the things about reality we need to affirm and to build a movement on a specific philosophical outlook. So we're close enough. It's just a question of whether we're a little bit more Aristotle and Aquinas flavored versus a little more Ayn Rand flavored on our approach to concepts. But this is the problem of universals, the problem of how do you define the nature and the source of abstractions? What are abstractions? That's what it's asking. What is dogness? What is catness? So to determine the relationship of concepts to the perceptual data, that's the question. And on this, Rand offers a good theory. So on the epistemological side of the question of concepts, Jacob and I agree. Rand has a good theory of how to relate concepts to percepts. And therefore, how do we prove the validity of scientific induction? This is another question that Objectivism addresses and gives a good answer to, the best answer that I've seen. The question of how do we come to generalizations? How do we know, on the basis of some observations, that such and such just is generally true? We talked about that a lot in that book study. So we go on the form of this absurd concession that Rand is talking about. Historically, there was a big concession. The philosopher's ultimate division into two camps. She describes the development of two camps in response to Descartes' puzzle. She would call them the rationalists and the empiricists. Descartes would be in the rationalist school, and there would be others as well. Locke and Hume would be in the empiricist school, and she considers both of these schools to have some errors, because they do not sufficiently address the question of how do you get from perception to conception. That's the key issue. So the philosophers divided into two camps, those who claimed that man obtains his knowledge of the world by deducing it exclusively from concepts, which you see in Descartes and others, concepts which come from inside his head and are not derived from the perception of physical facts. She calls those the rationalists. And those who claimed that man obtains his knowledge from experience, which is held to mean by direct perception of immediate facts with no recourse to concepts, which she calls the empiricists. So this is a puzzle, an ongoing philosophical discussion over a period of hundreds of years. She summarizes it as those who joined the witch doctor by abandoning reality and those who clung to reality by abandoning their mind. And then she comes to the most important recent philosopher, and that's Immanuel Kant. She says that Kant formalized this state of a battle between these two camps, where neither seems to understand how to integrate. He formalized it and closed the door of philosophy to reason, and his name was Immanuel Kant. So Kant lived, I think he died around the year 1805 or 1810 or something like that, so flourishing around the time of the American Revolution. Kant gave metaphysical expression to the psychoepistemology of Attila and the witch doctor, and to their primordial existential relationship. That's a very compact sentence, but when she talks about the relationship between Attila and the witch doctor, she means this predicament that they have, where one of them seems only oriented toward brute facts without knowing how to form abstractions, and one seems only oriented toward abstractions. Well, Kant came in and said, I have a metaphysical solution to this problem. I'm going to call it the phenomenal world, which is the world of Attila, and the noumenal world, which is the world of the witch doctor. So instead of there being just this problem philosophically of how do we bridge from our observations to our conceptions, Kant comes in and says the problem is not epistemological, it's metaphysical. Kant comes in and says the world actually is two worlds. It's not just a problem of how you think about it. There really is a phenomenal world. There really is a noumenal world. The phenomenal world is the world in which we observe things. The noumenal world is the higher world. So he gave a metaphysical theory that basically instantiated Attila in his world and the witch doctor in his world. And so he shuts out of the universe the psychoepistemology of the producer, the man who lives in this world and uses ideas. That can't exist in Kant's scheme of things.
Yeah, so question about Kant's view on this. When Kant is talking about the noumenal and the... what was that other term?
Phenomenal.
So the noumenal and the phenomenal world. When I was first hearing Rand talk about this, I was like, okay, what's the problem at first? So it kind of sounds like, Plato will talk about there being like this ideal world, and then what we see is shadows, so it's like, okay, if there's like this ideal blue jay, and then all the blue jays I see are a shadow of this ideal blue jay. And, Christians, of course, we believe there's, the physical world and the spiritual world, and we believe that the spiritual world is more, in a sense, more real than the physical world. If that's a proper way to phrase it. So how would Kant's views, is this the same thing Kant's getting at, or is he getting at more of, hey, you have the real world and then you have your psychological perception of the real world?
There are different ways to understand what Kant is doing, but I think that in the next page or two, you'll see where Rand is trying to diverge from Kant. I don't think that Kant is saying that there is a difference between perception and reality, and that's it. Or between your conception and reality. So, for example, Kant is not limiting his claims to saying, hey, there's a stick that's in a cup of water and it looks bent. He's not saying, hey, your eyes could seem to trick you. It's not just that. Although he might use that as an example of what he's talking about. And Rand addresses that specific issue of like the bent stick in water. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
I think you're getting at my question as well, which is Kant saying the problem, the source of the problem, when we ask the question, how do we go from perception to conception, is not necessarily in ourselves. The problem is in reality itself, that it's impossible. It is out of our reach. Is that what you mean when you say it's metaphysical, not epistemological?
It'll become more clear as we read these next couple pages. But when Kant says that there's a problem of there's a difference between the phenomenal and the noumenal world, he has a theory, and he calls it the Copernican revolution. He has a theory that the way that our minds work puts things that it observes into a certain framework, and that framework cannot be changed, just like there's an operating system in our mind, and therefore certain concepts such as time and space and other logical concepts, they just are part of our operating system, not part of reality. So now, if you're trying to ask if that is a metaphysical point, well, it's a point about ourselves, which is a metaphysical question, but it's also, in a sense, it bridges into epistemology. So I'm not sure how I would answer your question.
Sure, but so he would affirm that part of the limitation is within us, is that we cannot change, we cannot alter the way in which we perceive reality, and that's the main issue he would get at, or at least part of the problem.
Yes, and Rand's going to summarize it, and it becomes really clear on the next page. So let me get to that, sure. And then we'll back tread and we'll figure out if there's any missing points. So this is a summary of Kant's view, and Rand is accurate on Kant. What Kant did is he turned the world over to Attila, but reserved for the witch doctor the realm of morality. And she explains his motives here. Kant's expressly stated purpose was to save the morality of self-abnegation and self-sacrifice. That's what he believed in, because he was from a Christian background, I think Lutheran. And he understood that the age of reason was a threat to his worldview including a system of duty-based morality. So he knew that system of self-sacrifice could not survive without a mystic base, and that had to be saved from reason. So she writes, Attila's share of Kant's universe includes the earth, physical reality, man's senses, perceptions, reason, and science, all of it labeled as the phenomenal world. The witch doctor's share is another higher reality labeled the noumenal, and a special manifestation labeled the categorical imperative, which comes from the noumenal world, which dictates to man the rules of morality and which makes itself known by means of a feeling, a special sense of duty. So this is Kant's complicated, convoluted argument for why we ought to follow our feelings. It's because there's a different world, and that world is pressing upon us, but we can't identify it with our minds. So he's made an argument for why something that he's asserting is true, but why he can't prove it. That's why he would call it a transcendental argument, because his argument is not, here's my reasons and here's why it's true. His argument is, here's what's true, and here's my reasons for why you can't have reasons to prove it. That is a transcendental argument. And so he writes, or Rand writes, the phenomenal world, said Kant, is not real. Reality as perceived by man's mind is a distortion. The distorting mechanism is man's conceptual faculty. Now, Ryan, this gets your claim a bit, or your question a bit. She thinks that the fact that we have a conceptual faculty and that it has to follow certain rules like logic, Kant thought that was a distorting influence. So she goes on, man's basic concepts, time, space, existence, etc. There's 12, I think. They are not derived from experience or reality, but come from an automatic system of filters in his consciousness. And these are labeled the categories, the forms of perception, which impose their own design on his perception of the external world and which make him incapable of perceiving it in any manner other than the one in which he does perceive it. She writes, this proves, according to Kant, that man's concepts are only a delusion, but they are a collective delusion. This is important, because all people are constituted according to this way, which means that all of us have this certain collective delusion that we have bought into. No one can escape it. So for this reason, we know that, she says, reason, or Kant would say reason and science are limited, but they are valid so long as they deal with this world, with a permanent, predetermined collective delusion. So the criterion of reason's validity was switched from the objective to the collective. In other words, if we all think this way, then it must be correct, at least subjectively correct, good enough. So you can see there's a subjectivism now built in. Now, Kant is difficult, and Rand is painting with a broad brush. There will be people that will nitpick here. But essentially, I think this is correct. Rand goes on, but they are impotent to deal with the fundamental metaphysical issues of existence which belong to the noumenal world. Fundamental would mean things like morality and duty. The noumenal world, and that's his whole goal, is to separate duty from observation. Which, if you're familiar with Aristotle, if you're familiar with Ayn Rand, her goal is to integrate those two and to show how moral obligations are based in the facts of reality. But Kant is the opposite on this issue, and that's a fundamental issue. That's why she would consider him an enemy. So the noumenal world is unknowable. It is the world of real reality, superior truth, things in themselves, things as they are. And by that he always means things as they are not perceived by man, but just as they are not perceived. So she writes, even apart from the fact that Kant's theory of the categories is the source of man's concepts, it was a preposterous invention, his argument amounts to a negation, not only of man's consciousness, but of any consciousness, of consciousness as such. So first of all, she thinks that his theory is just preposterous, which I agree. I've listened to his argumentation in favor of it. It's just a made-up thing. It's just an idea that he came up with. He doesn't demonstrate it. But the conclusion is worse. The conclusion, and Rand shows, his argument runs as follows, in essence. Man is limited to a consciousness of a specific nature, which perceives by a specific means, and no others. Well, that is true. We do have a consciousness of a specific nature. We do perceive by certain means, such as our eyes and our ears. Okay, so that's all true so far. He says, because that's true, therefore, consciousness is not valid. That's his conclusion. Man is blind because he has eyes, deaf because he has ears, deluded because he has a mind, and the things he perceives do not exist because he perceives them. So he's taking this idea of methodological doubt that you saw in Descartes, and he's putting it right into your theory of how our minds work, and saying, because of the fact that you perceive something in a certain way, therefore it's not reliable. Now, if you go back to the Objectivism book study and you look on the early sections, especially chapter 2 on perception, you'll understand the kind of error that Kant is making here. It's in Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, chapter 2, perception. You're going to see why the validity of the senses is axiomatic, and why when we misperceive, is what we would maybe call it, we're actually misconceiving. Your ears do not lie unless you're on drugs. Your eyes do not lie, unless somebody has hit you over the head and broken your apparatus. Even if you're colorblind, your eyes are not lying. Your eyes are simply giving you a means of perception, which must be interpreted by the mind. And that's the point that she makes there. And so errors of, say the train track problem where two train tracks seem to converge in the distance, or the stick bent in water, those kinds of things, or colorblindness, those are easily explainable, and they're not a justification for doubting our senses.
Would you say that what Kant is saying is because our perceptions of reality are, in a manner of speaking, mediated through the means of our brain, of our sense perception, he believes that fundamentally that makes reality unknowable?
Yes.
Okay. So in a sense, he's saying unless we could see as God sees in an unmediated, raw fashion, until that point, we're essentially doomed. We need to have a hyper-skepticism regarding our sense perception.
Yes, I do think that that's part of it,
Okay.
but also not just a skepticism toward our sense perception, but also toward our ability to form concepts. Because even things like cause and effect are going to come into question here. And if you follow the development of Kant's ideas through to Hegel takes Kant's skepticism toward concepts very seriously. Hegel actually thinks that there's a higher way of thinking in which you affirm contradictory ideas, and that makes its way into Marxism. So there's a lot at stake here.
So not just perceptions, but also conclusions we might make regarding our conceptions are also inescapably flawed to the point that they're untrustworthy. Yes. Okay. All right.
Yes. Well, we'll go on in the reading here. So Rand describes Kant's version of morality was total abject selflessness. This is true if you study Kant. And this is not just one person's opinion of Kant. This is actually what Kant taught. An action is moral, said Kant, only if one has no desire to perform it, but performs it out of a sense of duty, and derives no benefit from it of any sort, neither material nor spiritual. A benefit destroys the moral value of an action. Thus, if one has no desire to be evil, one cannot be good. If one has, one can. That's Kant's theory. So bottom of page 32, the major line of philosophers rejected Kant's noumenal world quite speedily, but they accepted his phenomenal world and carried it to its logical consequences. The view of reality as mere appearance, the view of man's conceptual faculty as a mechanism for producing arbitrary constructs, not derived from experience or facts, the view of rational certainty as impossible, of science as unprovable, of man's mind as impotent, and above all, the equation of morality with selflessness. Now that's what's come to dominate intellectually in our time, in the 20th century. I would also make a note that there is a connection between some of Kant's ideas and some of Cornelius Van Til's ideas. And that's true both in terms of what they affirm on some issues. For example, if you look at my debate with Seth from like 2 or 3 years back, Seth granted Hume's premise about not being able to know cause and effect, or not being able to know certain things. And he worked from there. And he follows Kant in that. And it's the skepticism that leads to Van Tillians trying to solve the problem by means of positing not a mediated knowledge, but an immediate knowledge inside every human being. That's their proposed solution to this problem of skepticism. But we don't grant that there's a problem, so we diverge from them at Hume. That's our diverging point. Anyway, so the Van Tillians, they agree with some of Kant's premises, but they follow from Kant historically. If you look at who Van Til's teachers were, and if you look at who taught those teachers, it actually just traces straight back to German idealism. And that's why the language of Van Til is German idealism, even if he didn't affirm their overall system and worldview. It was his educational background.
Real quick, just Rand doesn't go into this, but I'm curious if you would know whether Kant's morality of selflessness is a consequence of his collectivist epistemology.
I don't know Kant well enough to know the answer to that. My guess would be that it was his religious upbringing and some ideas that he had absorbed about Christianity and what he thought Christianity meant that led him to start out with being committed to this altruism. idea. Although
Right.
he didn't use the term altruism. He talked about the duty ethic, but eventually it became known as altruism. I think that was his fundamental point of allegiance.
Okay.
And that he invented a collectivist epistemology because he knew that you couldn't justify this duty ethic on the basis of an Aristotelian outlook.
Right. I see that. So that would be his starting point. I can understand, though I'm not an expert on this, I would suspect with the context he is in church history, if he is Lutheran, as you mentioned, that some of that pietism that was prevalent within Lutheranism at the time was contributed to that.
I agree with that, and also Lutheranism is a development out of Catholicism, and Catholicism had for 1,000 years been preaching death to self. It had been celebrating the saints that would purposely whip themselves and purposely eat stale bread and sleep on rocks. So we know that within Christian history there has been this idea of death to self, and that ultimately comes back to some of the sayings of the apostles and Jesus Christ taken out of context, taken to mean something beyond what they actually meant. And we've explained that at FTNCI a lot, but so I mean it's no surprise that somebody like Immanuel Kant would be pro-death to self and all these things that we hear preached by David Platt and Ed Stetzer today. It's a mistake that started far earlier than Kant, but that has now led to the necessary demolition of even science and the demolition of philosophy itself in order to preserve the mistake, because that's how committed they are. That's the power of a moral commitment. When you believe that something is right or wrong, you will defend it. If you get morality wrong, then you're eventually going to destroy philosophy. You're going to destroy Western civilization. All right, let's go to the top of 33. Oh, good, Greg.
I think I just wanted to bring up the C.S. Lewis quote that you're very fond of. I won't read it just because it's kind of long, but C.S. Lewis said that that the idea that everything has to be unselfish was crept in from Kant and the Stoics, and is no part of the Christian faith. So even C.S. Lewis wrote his piece about how if you look at the Christian faith, if you look at the Bible, what we see, it's not this radical unselfishness, this monster that Kant put together and that is preached in most churches. It's not what you actually see in Scripture. And as you and I were talking about, the other day, I mentioned to you that when I was growing up in church, I thought that unselfishness was morality. Like it wasn't even on my radar that there could be another perspective out there. But I mean, you look at Scripture and, the fact that we have good things, even in the 23rd Psalm, God setting a table before me in the presence of my enemies. This idea of having a banquet that I can personally enjoy. I mean, that's, it's a good thing, to take care of yourself and to love yourself. And, so it's kind of, Kant took something and he went just way, way, way too far with it and took things way out of context. And I guess, one other thing, and I hope I don't, derail the conversation, but, in terms of the epistemology, it reminds me of the Matrix question. One of our first videos we did years ago, I asked Jacob about, the Matrix question. He said, well, what evidence do you have for the Matrix? And that was very influential to me because I have all of this evidence around me that the world is real. I look at the world around me and it's rational, it's consistent. If I pick up my phone, it doesn't just magically turn into a bird, like it might in a dream. Things don't flicker. I don't end up with a loading screen when I walk into a building.
It would be hard to imagine being a scientist and agreeing with Kant on these things. So I think when you read Kant, you're just stupefied. It's like, what? So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I do think there's connecting tissue there between that morality of selflessness and Kant's skepticism toward our ability to know reality. I think both are obviously contradicted, really, by the biblical doctrine of the Imago Dei. It's makes no sense that Christians would affirm either of those ideas when you apply that doctrine, because if we really believe that God is good, that he is loving, that he's relational or communicative, and that we are made in his image to glorify him by reflecting his character, his nature, it's inconceivable to me that we would then conclude that, well, he gave us a mind and a world in which we cannot actually perceive the world or interpret the world he made for us correctly, to come to right conclusions about him. And too often in the Reform world, we've taken our doctrine of the fallenness of man so far that image is apparently, in their minds, so obscured that that's impossible, that we cannot assess the evidence assess the evidence of the reality God has created and of himself being revealed in that.
That's well said. It reminds me of some quote. I don't remember who said it, but I can't imagine that God would have given me a mind, but intended me to forego its use. So let's go to the top of page 33. Now let's talk about the way that scientists are impacted by Kant's ideas. While scientists were performing outstanding feats of disciplined reason, breaking down the barriers of the unknowable in every field of knowledge, charting the course of light rays in space or the course of blood in the capillaries of man's body, what philosophy was offering them as interpretation of and guidance for their achievements was the plain witch doctrine of Hegel, who proclaimed that matter does not exist at all. That's why he is a dialectic idealist. Or I forget the specific phrase, but he is a dialectic idealist, and then his followers turned on him and said that we don't want to be idealists, we'll be materialists. So then you get Marxism is dialectic materialism. But for Hegel, the idealist, he says that matter does not exist at all. Everything is idea with a capital I, and not somebody's idea, just idea. And that this idea operates by a dialectical process of a new superlogic which proves that contradictions are the law of reality, that A is non-A. That's Hegel's system. And from Hegel, you immediately get Marx after. Middle of page 33. While businessmen were rising to spectacular achievements, they were releasing man's productive energy in new ways in the 19th century. Philosophy was offering as an evaluation of their achievements and as guidance for the rest of society pure Attilaism of Marx, who proclaimed that the mind does not exist, that everything is matter, that matter develops itself by the dialectical process of its own superlogic, of contradictions, of what is true today will not be true tomorrow, that the material tools of production determine men's ideological superstructure, which means machines create men's thinking, not the other way around, that muscular labor is the source of wealth, that physical force is the only practical means of existence, and so on. So top of page 34, Rand says that, okay, so what did philosophy offer as an antidote to this weird system from Marx? Well, American and English philosophers in the 1900s, they offered pragmatism as the solution to Marxism. And it gets worse. So what's pragmatism? They declared that philosophy must be practical and that practicality consists of dispensing with all absolute principles and standards. So the problem with Marx was not that he was rejecting logic. The problem with Marx was that he was being too logical and too abstract, too idealistic. So the pragmatists argued that there's no such thing as objective reality or permanent truth, that truth is that which works. Its validity can be judged only by its consequences. This is John Dewey's philosophy, by the way, and others. And anything must be tried by a rule of thumb, that reality is not firm, but it is fluid and indeterminate. So I'll go to the top of page 35 now. Okay, so as the philosophers were saying that, others were being influenced by a different variety of development from this. A different variety that said that knowledge consists of facts, not of facts, sorry. Knowledge consists not of facts, but of words. Words unrelated to objects, words of an arbitrary social convention as an irreducible primary. I think this is related to the analytic school of philosophy. Now, scientists they generally fall toward this analytic school, as they would logically. Scientists were allowed to claim knowledge on this theory, but only as long as they didn't claim certainty. So those are the rules for the scientists in the 20th century. Rand writes, there are two conditions in order to be a scientist. You can never claim certainty about your knowledge, since certainty is unknowable to man. And you have to claim instead percentages of probabilities, not troubling oneself with such questions as how one calculates percentages of the unknowable. That's a problem for the statisticians today. If you don't know the actual, like if you don't have knowledge first, what are you counting? And then B, the other condition was that he claimed as absolute knowledge the proposition that all values lie outside the sphere of science, that reason is impotent to deal with morality, that moral values are a matter of subjective choice dictated by one's feelings, not one's mind. And that is the dominant position of scientists and of philosophers today, is that you just cannot demonstrate morality. Rand summarizes this, and I put an exclamation point in my margin here. The great treason of the philosophers was that they never stepped out of the Middle Ages, they never challenged the witch doctor's code of morality. I think we've seen that in our discussion of Kant and others. So Rand goes on, there is a doctrine, instead, that man is a sacrificial animal. That is the doctrine of Karl Marx. That is the doctrine of our politicians today. Man is a sacrificial animal. He has no right to exist for his own sake. Service to others is the only justification for his existence. Self-sacrifice is his highest moral duty, virtue, and value. Now, Rand points out that this is nothing new. This is not a 20th century thing, 19th century thing. In savage societies, men practiced the ritual of human sacrifice, immolating individual men on sacrificial altars for the sake of what they regarded as their collective tribal good. Today they're still doing it, only the agony is slower and the slaughter is greater. Now, why would the agony be slower? Well, a society that controls people by means of regulatory state and welfare redistribution of wealth, high taxation, that is making life as a human being, life as a free thinking person, difficult over the entire span of your life. And so the statism that we see in the Western countries today, or especially the outright totalitarian dictatorship that she was thinking of with communist Russia, Soviet Union, those were situations where the suffering was slower, the slaughter was greater, especially if you think of communism. All right, so let's go to the middle of page 36. She's going to do, this is the last couple of pages in our discussion today. She's going to summarize the philosophy of Auguste Comte and also of Nietzsche and of Jeremy Bentham, Herbert Spencer, and then finally leading to Karl Marx. So this is to get an understanding of how we got to where we are today, and today meaning the 20th century when she was writing. So Auguste Comte is the founder of positivism, and you can read in her section there, he invented a religion of self-sacrifice. He invented the term altruism, which means placing others above yourself, putting their interests above yours. And that actually describes Kant's system, but the term came after. The term came from Comte. Then there was Nietzsche. Nietzsche rebelled against the self-sacrifice code. Nietzsche is a hero to today's neo-pagan movement, to the reactionary conservatives today. Nietzsche, especially the pagan ones, so Nietzsche proclaimed, well, he rebelled against altruism, and he said that the sacrifice of oneself to others should be replaced by the sacrifice of others to oneself. So he was a subjectivist individualist. He proclaimed that the ideal man is moved not by reason but by his blood. Does that sound familiar today? By his instincts, feelings, his will to power, that he is predestined by birth to rule others and sacrifice others to himself. While they are predestined by birth to be his victims and slaves, that reason, logic, principles are futile and debilitating, morality is useless, the Superman is beyond good and evil, that he is a beast of prey whose ultimate standard is nothing but his own whims. So Rand points out that is turning the idea of Attila into a moral hero. Yes, Attila is good. That's the point of Nietzsche. And that's why the Nazis celebrated him, because they said that for too long Germany has been, the anvil. It's time for us to be the hammer. That was their goal. Go ahead, Ryan.
In a society in which altruism is the moral norm, would you say that paves the way for a guy like Nietzsche to say, well, everyone here is primed to look for someone to give themselves up for. Everyone is for the sake of their own virtue or feeling virtuous, prepared to give themselves over to self-sacrifice for someone else's sake. Wouldn't a guy like someone thinking like Nietzsche be able to manipulate everyone in a incredibly effective way by convincing society, hey, I am the man who needs your sacrifice, who is in need and needs that? And do we not see that today with so many who've convinced society that they're the prime victim, the prototypical oppressed individual who needs you to give up your individual rights, to give up your possessions for my sake? Would you say that a society given to one paves the way for individuals who choose the other, or am I misunderstanding something fundamental about those moral philosophies? I'm
not sure what the connection is from Nietzsche to the people that deal in grievance hustling today. I'm not sure if that's a solid connection. I mean, clearly there is this immediate sense of, I'm going to fleece you. I'm going to take from you, and it's going to come to me. So there's that. We would call it a subjectivistic individualism or a subjectivistic self-interest that's not based on reality or justice. So there's a connection. But Nietzsche was not describing the grievance hustlers. Nietzsche was describing what he characterized as distinct kinds of societies. And so he thought that the Jewish people and that the Christians were slave societies, that they had a mentality of slaves, that they wanted to be a slave to a god. And he came in and said, and I don't know the extent to which he was a pagan explicitly, but he came in and said, God is dead. And these societies are based on wrong premises. And he wanted to say that the societies that would dominate in the future would be those that looked at those other societies and said, you want to be a slave? Sure, that can be arranged. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
From what I've heard of Nietzsche, and correct me if I'm wrong, is, or maybe it wasn't Nietzsche, maybe it was somebody else, but there's somebody who wrote this poem about, a man who goes to the village, saying, God is dead, we've killed him. And, people are mocking him. They seem to agree with him in this story, but they're mocking him like, hey, well, what's the problem? Did he lose his way? And so you have this, bit of blasphemy basically from the townspeople, but he says, look, who has unchained this earth from its sun? And, he basically said, without God, what perspective can you possibly have in the world? Everything is, turned upside down. What framework can you possibly have? And if I remember correctly, he ended up at the end of his life in a mental institution, with basically babbling mad ravings. Am I correct? Am I thinking of Nietzsche or somebody else?
That is Nietzsche you're describing. And something to know about Nietzsche is that he wrote poetry, and he wrote in a way that was not didactic. It was like he was doing interpretive art when he wrote. And so it's hard to say whether he affirmed everything. And there are beautiful lines of poetry within his work. So when we talk about Nietzsche, we have to talk about how he was received by the Nazis, what they took him to be saying, which may be distinct from what he actually meant. Maybe he was just experimenting and saying, hey, this is one way of seeing the world, but he didn't affirm it himself. Who knows? There's also a lot of contradictions, so that makes it more difficult. But eventually, his approach did end up troubling him psychologically, I think. All right, let's go on to the next little part. So that describes Nietzsche, the one who seems to be celebrating Attila as the moral hero. Let's go on to the next part, which is Jeremy Bentham. Okay, so there's two champions of capitalism in the 19th century. And they would be Jeremy Bentham and Herbert Spencer. And both of them were really bad at defending capitalism, and here's why. Rand writes, Bentham, the champion of capitalism, defended it by proclaiming the greatest happiness of the greatest number as its moral justification. Now, if you try to justify capitalism on collectivist morality, you're not going to really be able to do it for very long. So he propounded a hedonistic calculus for men's moral guidance. So you're supposed to think about what's the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and that needs to be your calculation for every decision you make. Very difficult to do that. The next one is Herbert Spencer. Now, he was a champion of capitalism, and he offered as the moral justification the survival of the species, the survival of the human race, which again is a collectivistic justification for the system. So on Spencer's view, whoever was of no value to the race had to perish. So now we've associated capitalism and this theory of letting men free with this idea that men should dominate others and try to exterminate other men, and survival of the fittest Darwinianism, and even racism, I think. I haven't studied Spencer enough to know, but he was one of the main advocates of capitalism. So what is the problem when you have those as the most prominent advocates of the view? That's not going to help. All right, go ahead, Greg.
I was actually thinking about this issue the other day. It's like some people try to conflate, Darwinism with capitalism, but, if you think about like a Darwinian, type world where it's survival of the fittest, you don't have rule of law. If you have one dinosaur killing another dinosaur, it's just, the law of the jungle. You don't have courts coming in and saying, no, Mr. T-Rex, you cannot infringe on Mr. Triceratops's intellectual property. So, I just wanted to, throw that out there, real quick.
That's helpful. The law of the jungle is not capitalism. I think that its enemies would want to say so, though. Okay, I'm just going to move forward, and we just want to wrap up pretty quick. So Rand describes this, both Spencer and Bentham, and it turns out that both of them were operating on the premise of altruism and collectivism in their attempted defense of capitalism. Now, Rand comes in and she says you can't defend capitalism except for by reason, individualism, individual rights. That's and a belief in justice, a belief in morality, and an objective moral system. That's a whole different approach. And that's why at the front page of our website, christianintellectual.com, it says become a Christian defender of reason, individualism, and capitalism. We think those three things need to go together. And we agree with Rand on that. Now, let's get to one of history's worst villains, both as a person and as an influence on the world. This is Karl Marx, the most consistent translator of the altruist morality into practical action and political theory, advocated a society where all would be sacrificed to all, starting with the immediate immolation of the able, the intelligent, the successful, and the wealthy. That's Marxism. So Marx was, instead of being rejected as a crackpot historian who wanted to advocate a system where everybody could steal from everybody, he was celebrated as a noble but impractical idealist. That was the kind of reaction that he got from his detractors. This shows us the role of philosophy. Without philosophy, how do you fight this? Now, Rand summarizes, the great treason of the philosophers was that they, the thinkers, defaulted on the responsibility of providing a rational society with a code of rational morality. They had nothing better to offer than the witch doctor's morality of human sacrifices. Self-denial, self-abasement, self-immolation, suffering, guilt, and death. So that's where our reading takes us to this week. And next week we're going to see where that leaves us in the 20th century. If that's where philosophy has taken us so far, what do we have now? And showing how... so Rand is going to show how that led to the American culture that we have today. She's going to show how, in light of that, these are certain things that must be challenged. These are ideas that must be challenged, because those ideas have taken us where we are. We need new ideas to get us out of this mess. She's going to give us an understanding of what kind of movement can bring us out of this mess. And she's going to offer us a couple of non-negotiables for such a movement. If we got where we are today by a rejection of reason, and also by a rejection of individual rights, then the movement that's going to get us out is going to have to be a movement that explicitly upholds reason as the standard for what we're going to claim as true. When we argue with other people, we don't say, because I feel it. That's not the right way to argue with other people. We must say, here are the reasons. Reason is your standard for arguing, and human flourishing requires that we ban initiation of force. So she's going to say we have to reject the witch doctor and we have to reject the Attila. And if you can make a movement that explicitly rejects those two mindsets, then you have a movement that has a chance to restore the American way of life, Americanism. We have a chance to restore something that is worth living in. We have a chance to reform our country. So that's what Rand is arguing. I wanted to bring in just a little bit of other discussion if anybody wants to, and then we'll wrap up maybe about 10 minutes from now. Anyone want to add any comments on what we've discussed today or applications to what has happened in the time since Rand wrote?
So I guess bringing it back to, you mentioned before sense perception being axiomatic. And I think when I look at philosophy, look at, objective philosophy, not just objectivist, but, objective philosophy as a, broader term. Human beings, we know that 2 + 2 = 4. We know, I think, therefore I am. There's things in the world that are so obvious, that they cannot not be true. I believe we call those axioms. But then you have that matrix question. How do I know that the world around me that I perceive actually exists? That gets into sense perception. And since you mentioned, sense perception being axiomatic, I was wondering if you had any commentary on that.
That is something that I'd recommend go to the Objectivism book study. It's at christianintellectual.com/objectivism, and you can see all the replays. And it's just because we've discussed it in such great depth in there. If there's a specific question about it that you have, I could answer it here, but it has to be a pretty narrow question.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I'm still watching through those. And I guess the one other, I think, thought that comes up with all of this is what we see in the current, quote unquote culture wars. We see the absolute insanity of the left, but then we're also seeing this leftward drift of the right with, you have Caitlyn Jenner on Fox News, quote unquote Caitlyn Jenner. And you also see, you watch Fox News, you also have a lot of this kind of right-wing socialism. So I guess those two things would be, the total insanity of the left, and then the socialist drift of the right.
Now, the socialist drift of the right, this new family-friendly socialism, which is the national conservative movement, that can be explained as, in terms of what Rand said were the non-negotiables. They tried to negotiate on them. They want to go by their feelings, and they want to use force, and they want it now. They are illiberal conservatives. Now, there's this idea of classical liberalism, this idea that we believe in liberty. We believe in limited government. We believe in individual rights. And they've rejected it. They've rejected the Constitution. They've rejected individual rights, property rights. They are illiberal in that they want to impose by force their values. They want to impose them economically. They want to impose them culturally and morally. And that movement, therefore, is not the same as other conservative movements. Illiberal conservatism is different from liberal conservatism. And I'm a liberal conservative, a classical liberal conservative. Yeah, in our next discussion next week, I will bring in some of these 14 points that the National Conservatives use as their platform, their statement of principles. And I'll explain why I think they imply a rejection of the U.S. Constitution, and they imply a rejection of the principle of limited government and individual rights. Now, talking a little bit more on the philosophical side of things, I want to draw a connection between the philosophy of 100 years ago and the science of today. The great scientists of the 1900s and the 1800s, there's these famous names. You could go back to Einstein or Schrodinger or Bohr or Heisenberg. Now, these are great scientists of 100 years ago or further back. And they're not the only ones, but these these men said certain things, and I wanted to quote because I just found this summary of things that they were saying on the philosophical topics 100 years ago. Remember, they were coasting on the accomplishments of a pro-reason society. But so they had great scientific achievements, but listen to what the philosophers were saying listen to what the scientists were saying about philosophy 100 years ago. And I'm going to compare that to what the scientists are saying today. And I use the term scientist really loosely when I'm talking about the people today. So let me compare what Heisenberg said. I think that modern physics has definitely decided in favor of Plato. In fact, the smallest unit of matter, the smallest units are not physical objects in the ordinary sense. They are forms, ideas, which can be expressed unambiguously only in mathematical language. So he said that. This is Heisenberg. Now he says, my mind was formed by studying philosophy, Plato, and that sort of thing. So now compare that to the people that came after him, such as Richard Dawkins today. I mean, it is a compliment when I say that you could almost define a philosopher as someone who won't take common sense for an answer. By all means, let's be open-minded, but not too open-minded that our brains drop out, says Richard Dawkins. Okay, so now here's Einstein. Here's a quote of what Einstein thought about philosophy. I fully agree with you about the significance and educational value of methodology as well as history and philosophy of science. So many people today, and even professional scientists, seem to me like someone who has seen thousands of trees but has never seen a forest. A knowledge of the historic and philosophical background gives that kind of independence from prejudices of its generation, from which most scientists are suffering. The independence created by philosophical insight is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after truth. So that's the philosophical mindset that Einstein had. Now compare that to Lawrence Krauss today. Philosophy is a field that unfortunately reminds me of that old Woody Allen joke, those that can't do, teach, and those that can't teach, teach Jim. And the worst part of philosophy is the philosophy of science. The only people, as far as I can tell, that read work by philosophers of science are other philosophers of science. It has no impact on physics whatsoever. They have every right to feel threatened because science progresses and philosophy doesn't. Okay, so now I'm going to go to two other quotes, one from Schrodinger and one from Bohr, and then I'm going to compare them with one from Bill Nye and one from Neil deGrasse Tyson. So here's Erwin Schrodinger. The plurality that we perceive is only an appearance. It is not real. Vedantic philosophy has sought to clarify it by a number of analogies, one of the most attractive being the many-faceted crystal, which, while showing hundreds of little pictures of what is in reality a single existent object, does not really multiply that object. So that's what he was thinking about 100 years ago. Bill Nye, the science guy. The idea that reality is not real, or that what you sense and feel is not authentic, is something that I'm skeptical of. That's as much as he's able to say. Just, he doesn't know what philosophy is, right? He doesn't know how to engage these ideas. And finally, the quote from Bohr and then from Tyson. Bohr writes, I consider those developments in physics during the last decades, which have shown how problematic such concepts of objective and subjective are, a great liberation of thought. There is no quantum world, there is only an abstract quantum physical description. It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature. Notice the Kantian perspective. And then here's Tyson. Philosophy can really mess you up. And he says, yeah, exactly. Exactly. My concern here is that the philosophers believe they actually are asking deep questions about nature. And to the scientist, it's, what are you doing? Why are you concerning yourself with the meaning of meaning? So this is the result, the intellectual inheritance that we have. It went from confused yet well-intentioned creators to those who just mock and call themselves scientists. Well, I'm going to wrap up our video today. I want to mention that FTNCI, ChristianIntellectual.com, is equipping Christians to be defenders of reason, individualism, and capitalism. We agree with Ayn Rand that for there to be a new American Renaissance, there will need to be a movement of new intellectuals. and those people must be defined by the two commitments that Ayn Rand named. Reason, not feelings, should be our method of knowledge. No one should be able to initiate physical force against other people. If we are going to reform our country, this is the path forward. Thank you for joining us for this session of the New Intellectual Book Study. Please leave a like or give this material a share. Find the schedule of our upcoming meetings at christianintellectual.com/intellectual. I look forward to talking with you again. God bless.